a brief story of the Roland TB-303. The arrival of the 1980s spawned many new innovations in electronic music. In the late 1970s, with the arrival of disco and other pioneering artists such as Kraftwerk, Giorgio Moroder, and Tangerine Dream, electronic artists were more often producing their own music in smaller home-based studios. Many of the electronic music products of the late 1970s were inspiring all new types of music. By 1980, drum machines such as Roland's TR-808 had redefined how beats and loops could be created, and other portable instruments such as Roland's Jupiter 4 were being used together to create all new electronic sounds. Roland also developed a new synchronization format called DIN-Sync, and started to add this to all of its devices such as the TR-808 and its flagship sequencer, the MC4. By using a smallish, round 5-pin DIN cable, which was the same on both ends, a serial synchronized connection could be made between two instruments, which enabled accurate timing and start and stop features between the microsequencers inside each instrument. This ability was a crucial part of Roland's new strategy with its instruments at the time, and they realized synchronization and compatibility with other instruments would be key for the industry going forward. Roland's engineer on the TR-808, Tadao Kikumoto, was working on a new set of instruments that were extremely portable with synchronization and that could be easily carried to gigs for use in new popular one-man bands. The first of these was the Roland TR-606 Drumatix, the new smaller cousin of his previous TR-808 design. With a similar sound but less features, the TR-606 was not designed to be a studio instrument, but something that could help with drum accompaniments at a small live show. To pair with this, Kikumoto's team also developed the TB-303 Bassline. At under $400 US each, this was a very modest price to pay to now have the ability to program and synchronize a rhythm and bass section for a gig, and was marketed as such. Both units even came with their own small gig carry bag. Although the TR-606 was relatively easy to program, the TB-303 had a rather complex programming nature, where the bass notes had to be entered into the sequencer separately from the note lengths and rests. This made it difficult for artists to program their bass line and led to much frustration, although unintentionally it also made for some great happy accidents. The TB-303 is a relatively simple bass synthesizer with a selectable square wave or saw wave VCO and a classic ladder filter design with a great squelchy resonant control. Although relatively nice and warm in the bottom end, the TB-303 could also squelch out entirely unrealistic bass tones, which would become its trademark in the near future. One of the first recorded uses of the TB-303 was by Charanjit Singh on his 1982 album Synthesizing 10 Ragas to a Disco Beat. This album makes use of a TR-808 and a TB-303 synchronized in a fashion together similar to acid house music that wouldn't be created or realized for another 4 years in the future. This album is brilliant and a seminal use of the TB-303 in a hypnotizing way that would eventually become the trademark of a new generation of musicians. Commercially, the TB-303 and the TR-606 did not sell very well, as they just weren't very practical for their intended use as accompaniment instruments. By 1984, Roland discounted the remaining units drastically to sell them off and end production. Flooding the market with the small, unwanted silver boxes was probably the best thing that could have happened for the budget studio musician creating electronic music in their home, and they found their way into the electronic music studios of those who could breathe new life into these instruments in ways not imagined. By 1983, the Music Instrument Digital Interface, or MIDI, was created as a partnership between Roland and Sequential Circuits, where they famously interfaced a Roland Jupiter 6 and a Prophet 600 at the 1983 Winter NAMM show. Not to abandon the older units requiring DIN-Sync, Roland kept the DIN format active for a few more years, adding both MIDI and DIN synchronization formats to its 1985 released drum machines, the TR-707 and the TR-727. It was around this time these instruments found their way into the studio of Chicago producers Future. DJ Pierre, Earl Spanky Smith Jr., and Herb J. were working to create new hypnotic dance music specifically for DJ Ron Hardy at the Chicago club The Music Box, and gave him the tapes of their new sound, some say as early as 1985. By 1987, Chicago's Trax Records released the seminal minimalist Future Acid Trax 12-inch, which used the TB-303 in a more squelchy fashion, where the filter was manipulated often to give it a pulsing, hypnotic effect. This was the birth of the acid house genre that would quickly take off with the other artists of the Chicago scene, such as Marshall Jefferson, Adonis, and Maurice, and others making similar and equally important tracks to solidify the genre. One of the key characteristics of the TB-303, exploited by the new creators of acid house, was its ability to add a slide note to any desired spot in a sequence loop. This was unlike any other sequencer available, where typically the portamento was added as a blanket effect to all notes in a sequence. The ability to slide notes, coupled with a well-placed individual accent, and then manipulating the filter cutoff and resonance, one could create liquidy movements between notes that were uniquely characteristic to the TB-303 sound, popularized by the artists on the Trax label. By 1988, the acid house movement had died down in the US, but it had been imported into the UK by DJ Danny Rampling, who continued to champion that sound at his London club Shoom. Its popularity and sound led to the 1988 Second Summer of Love and the start of the rave scene, where partiers would take over old warehouses and abandoned factories and dance all night to the sounds of acid house and the hypnotic movements of the 303. By 1994, artists such as Richie Houghton, known as Plastic Man, were using the 303 and TR-909 in a much harder and grittier minimalist way. Inspired by the sounds of Kraftwerk and Detroit's Juan Atkins, Derek May, and Kevin Saunderson, Plastic Man started to release more minimal and slower tracks, which dive deep into the space created by the hypnotic sounds of the 303 and reverb as featured on the 1994 song Plastique. Over 10 years after the TB-303 was discontinued, Josh Wink took the acid sound of the Little Silver Box to an entirely new level, adding an overdrive pedal to the output, causing an overdrive effect to the squelching, and created an all-new hit, Higher State of Consciousness. By this time, electronics hackers had designed new ways to modify the existing 303s to get a super squelchy sound from the box, one of them being the Devilfish mod, which was very popular. By sending in your stock 303, Robin Whittle's team would add in many new features such as extended bass response, overdrive control, additional decay adjustments, slide time control, and resonance control. Remarkably, the TB-303 was more popular than ever 10 years after it was discontinued and was the new sound of rave music. Many artists such as Hardfloor and Oliver Leaves Spice Lab used multiple TB-303s at once to achieve an incredible complexity of squelching and grooving bass, all at the same time. Hardfloor's Experience defined an all-new sound in rave that featured the 303's warbly sounds and epic filter builds that rocked a dance floor with a new energy and sound. Its popularity in rave music, unique programming, and sound made the prices on the TB-303 explode, and by the mid-90s they were now selling for well over $1,000 US. A few friends and I would scan the local pawn shops and resellers for 303s and other vintage gear, managing to unearth more than a few of them across the city.
Aye, aye. Goodbye.
Daft Punk kept the love of the TB-303 strong through the mid to late 90s with their 303-laden album, Homework, released in 1997. Homework is dripping with 303 and 909-based French house, and not only felt authentic, but was also edgy and cool in a whole new way from what acid house had been doing previously with the 303. Da Funk was an instant classic and still remains one of the most recognizable 303 patterns to this day. Roland Corporation tried to capitalize on the 303 craze with the release of the TB-303-inspired MC303 Groovebox. This unit, however, was not able to truly clone the much-wanted feel of the TB-303 bassline as it was programmed, particularly with the slide notes, and its harsh digital nature failed to capitalize on the pulse of what the market really wanted. The TB-303 to me was a sound that, although associated with rave music culture, had great use as a more simple instrument to provide a funky round bottom end to a club track. For me, I really liked the square wave setting, and then not so much adjustment on the filter or knobs in general. DIN syncing the 303 to my MSQ100 sequencer or my TR-808 was very typical, although I did find there was some slight sync issues at times, especially with the MSQ100 in a looping sequence. Sometimes I would just randomly program notes and then the rest and time into the TB-303 to see what sort of happy accident would happen. Quite often these accidents were something really unique and something you'd never otherwise create, which to me really defined how techno of this era was created. Just when the reign of the TB-303 was about to end, an even new sound called Big Beat emerged, using retro beat samples and a bold, brash sound with plenty of ravey 303 thrown into the mix. Fatboy Slim famously championed this with his club hit Everybody Needs a 303. It was about this time I wrote a song called Gin and Sin, which contained a hefty dose of 303 and big beat breaks as used in the EA Sports snowboarding game SSX. Technology was changing quickly at this time, and the term DAW had now come into existence as the digital audio workstation was common in most studios. With this increased processing power, one of the first analog-modeled synthesizers called Rebirth also took the world by storm. It was basically what everyone wanted and couldn't afford or find, a computer-based software studio that gave you a 303, an 808, and a 909 all in one studio, and it sounded great. By this time, 303 hardware clones were also common, and there's too many to really list, although I was a big fan of my Future Retro FR777 back in the early 2000s. Other manufacturers, such as DIN Sync's RE303 and the Cyclone Analogics TT303, finally nailed a true replica look and feel by the late 2000s. Now the legacy of the 303 lives on, with Roland finally producing a quality 303 replica of their own, the TB-03 boutique module, and also with Behringer's TD3, which both sound, look, and program just like the original TB-303. Arguably one of the most important electronic music instruments of the last century, who would have thought this little silver box by Roland would mean so much to music and electronic culture as we now know it?